The winter chill blew in, but we could not help but grin, for the hits on the charts warmed the hobs of our hearts and we danced as we made the disc spin. Newsflash people, it is July 1981. It is a fantastic top 10 this week. There is not a dull moment, so let's get to it. Kicking off with a section that's on the menu tonight in Springfield, Ohio, Hello and Goodbye. Leaving the top 10 this week is a former 4-week number one, Roxy Music's not very remarkable version of John Lennon's Jealous Guy. The B-side of this is pretty good though, and shuffling in to replace it is Men at Work with their first hit, Who Can It Be Now?, which kicked off a run of 5 straight top 10 hits, including a number one for Down Under. This one got to number 2 and had a funny old run in the top 10, sitting for 3 weeks at 9, rising, rising, sitting, falling, falling, rising, falling, rising, falling, and falling. Biggest hit to leave the chart this week was Sheena Easton's 9 to 5 Morning Train, a 2-week number one, and the biggest hit to enter this week was Jessie's Girl by Aussie Rick Springfield. Springfield came to prominence in the late 1960s as a member of the hard rockin' Zoot, and who had a handful of solo hits in the following years, before trying his luck in America and becoming a successful soap opera actor. Jessie's Girl would spend a week at number 1. Next number one coming up is Favourite 40 Sons by Soft Nifty Ravers. This one should be pretty easy to work out, but if you don't, the answer's right at the very end. At number 10 this week is a man who actually was in the actual Beatles themselves, Monsieur George Harrison, with his tribute to John Lennon all those years ago. 2 other surviving Beatles play drums and sing on this as well. I'll leave it to you to figure out which one does what. It all came a bit too late to catch the wave of post-Lennon grief though. It's also not really that good. It's got a nice enough tune, but Harrison's voice sounds like a chain-smoking choir boy with a mouthful of Christmas cake. I had to Google the lyrics, and they are kind of mean-spirited, full of all that stale, preachy oogly-boogly he peppers his later songs with. Perhaps a more fitting tribute to Lennon would have been not to have ghosted him out of his autobiography, published less than a year before. Anyway, all that considered, this one got no higher than number 9 last week and was soon gone from the charts after this week. Number 9 is the Melbourne band Men at Work with their first hit, Who Can It Be Now? Reaching number 2, this one hung around on the charts for 6 months and started a run which would see them become the first Australian act to have a number 1 album in New Zealand and the first Australian act to have the number 1 single and album simultaneously in the United States. In their initial incarnation, Men at Work were a taut, quirky group with a warmer sound than most new wave acts and a genuinely fine singer and great frontman in Colin Hay. Thanks to the ubiquity of the follow-up single Down Under, the band seems to be pigeonholed a little bit as a novelty act in the wave of Aussie acts that were briefly fashionable in the US in the early 80s rather than the genuine hit-making force that they were. 8 up from 10 last week is Devo Live, a 4-track EP centred around Whip It, which is usually considered the hit here. This has been around for 6 weeks at this point, aided no doubt by regular play on Countdown, the Sunday evening pop music show on the ABC, which helped the highly visual act when radio play was quite scarce. The record just seemed to be doing the rounds though, yet 15 weeks later it made number 1 and then, in a relatively rare instance, lost and regained the top spot, ending with 3 weeks atop all told. They followed up with a number 2 in Beautiful World and thereafter back to cult status. Number 7 this week is Canadian Legends Loverboy, falling out of the top 5 with Turn Me Loose, which had peaked at number 3. 10 weeks in the top 10 and 20 on the charts all up. This bode well for a promising career. But the follow-up, The Kid Is Hot Tonight, stalled at 58, and even though Working for the Weekend popped into the top 20, that promising career never materialised. In Australia, at least. 6 is another exciting newcomer, much beloved in this series, Kim Wilde with her debut, Kids in America. Hard to think this only made number 5. It was all over every radio station and every video program, and Kim was fresh and a relatable presence. She went on to have many more hits, as this series demonstrates, and as it turned out, a whole new career in TV. At 5, it's Billy Field with his super swinging Bad Habits, which we proved in edition 73 was a bit of a legend around these parts. Like Kim Wilde, I can't believe that this never made number 1. Everywhere you listen, you heard it all over, and it still sounds fresh and cool today. His follow-up, You Weren't in Love with Me, was a surprise number 1, and today Billy is still in the industry and still a majorly cool dude. Time for the trade-up, where we look at the records on this week's charts that never made the top 10 and prove one way or the other that local record buyer is an idiot. First up, and these are just a selection of quite a few contenders this week, we have The Who with You Better You Bet, which lumbered along for 9 weeks and got no higher than number 21. Don't blame the drummer. Australian Crawl, with the lead-off single from their Sirocco album, Things Don't Seem, got no higher than number 11 and certainly deserved better. It's the rockingest thing they ever did. 14 weeks it stood on the charts. And finally, the magnificent Vienna by Ultravox, one of the defining records of the year, also spent 14 weeks getting no higher than number 11. In the UK, it was denied from the top spot for 3 weeks by Joe Dolce's Shut Up or You Face. A proud moment indeed for Australia. Number 4, it's the long-forgotten Nolans who have the number 4 spot with their perfectly pleasant slice of 80s pop, Gotta Pull Myself Together. They aren't ABBA by a long stretch, but this is the kind of song you could imagine the Swedes having put out in their mid-70s heyday. A charming feature of this record is that the girls make no attempt whatsoever to hide their Irish accents, unlike so many acts of the time, Australians included, who sang in some mid-Atlantic drawl. Bit of a near-miss band all around. They get to number 3 next week, and the next 3 singles, though, would all narrowly miss the top 40. 9 of the 10 acts this week were making their first top 10 appearance. George Harrison was the sole exception, and Shakin' Stevens might just have been the most successful of them. I barely remember him, but the guy was a hit machine for a couple of years there. Not quite as popular as his brother Cat, but this kicked off a run of 4 top 10s, and he even did a duet with Bonnie Tyler. And as we saw in the previous edition, Bonnie Tyler is a pretty serious contender. This whole house is certainly energetic, and Stevens carries himself well in it, but it represents a central dichotomy of this week's chart. There's the new hip acts like Wild, Devo and Loverboy and Men at Work, and the throwback acts like Harrison and Billy Field. Well, I suspect the hip kids bought that one too. And Stars on 45. Go forward 2 months and the balance is still more or less the same. Go forward a year and it's still the same. Maybe the 80s weren't all the rush and push we remember. Number 2 is a real pop curiosity. Stars on 45 by Stars on 45. The band's name was originally just Stars On, but it's sort of mutated. When Devo Live knocks this off number 1, it'll be 2 chart toppers in a row where the band's name is in the song title. Anywho, SO45 is a Dutch studio group, and this record is a long medley of re-recorded versions of largely Beatles songs, with a few random deviations thrown in, all laid down over a stomping 136 beat per minute disco beat. They hired impersonators to sing the Beatle parts. The Lennon is good, McCartney less so, and Harrison sounds nothing like him. Ringo is criminally omitted. The ABBA impersonators I hired for a follow-up are somewhat better. There are a few neat deep cuts in the Beatles selection, but again, it's a novelty record, but a phenomenally successful one. 4 weeks at number 1, 3 at number 2, and it was the 3rd biggest hit for the year in Australia. Facts, 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 you are all insatiable fact junkies. Well, here's some more to pick the bones out of. The fastest tempo song the Beatles recorded was I Saw Her Standing There at about 160 beats a minute. The slowest was Because at 68 beats per minute, which bookends their career nicely, I think. Boring, dull and bland. Boring in Oregon, dull in Perth and Kinross, Scotland, and the Bland Shire in New South Wales are all members of the League of Extraordinary Communities. If you were to write out the names of all of the numbers at the rate of 1 number every 3 seconds, I calculate you'd be writing for 951 quadrillion, 293 quintillion, 759 trillion, 512 billion, 937 million, 600,000 years before you wrote a letter C. You'd be older than Madonna by the time you finished. Once your mind is recovered from the thorough blowing it just got from these facts, and once you've reaffixed your flipped wig, it's Val's Fantastic World of Fact. Biggest riser this week is Motown legend Smokey Robinson, a man whom I criminally left out of consideration as America's greatest living songwriter in a recent video, who shot up the charts from 38 to 23. But it was Smokey without fire, as this one spluttered out at 14. Still pretty freaking great. It's Down, Down, Down for Juice Newton's former number 2 Angel of the Morning, a falling angel dropping from 19 to 35. Follow-up Queen of Hearts made number 3, but after that Juice was squeezed dry and no further hits flowed. Biggest debutante this week was Rick Springfield's Jessie's Girl on its way to number 1 for a week and status as an 80s classic. And the longest running song in the charts this week with 20 weeks was Robert Palmer's Looking for Clues, and the last week of a run that only saw it get to number 23. This week in the USA, Aussie wimp rock overlords Air Supply dominated with The One You Love. PS were originally a marginally interesting band with slightly proggy leanings, but they learned from the Little River Band's successful toning down of their approach for the US market and fairly dominated with 8 top 5 hits and about 100 million records sold. Good for them. In the UK, it was the Specials with their scarifying Ghost Town in its second week of 3 on top. Written on tour in 1980, it reflected the sense of decay and despair in the UK at that time. This time last year, those cheery chappies, the Village People, held on to number 1 with Can't Stop the Music. And the next year, all their fellow cheery chappies would cheer as a proto-gay icon Charlene topped the charts with I've Never Been to Me. And number 1 album this week is old Billy Fields with Bad Habits. He's been on top for 2 weeks and he'll be deposed next week by Starsong 33 1/3, who in turn will be deposed by Australian Crawl's second album Sirocco, which will stay there for 6 weeks. Old Taylor Swift has spent the last couple of years pretty much dominating the conversation on popular music, and her Eras tour has been an all-consuming phenomenon. And while Switty, she's pretty great and all, there's an even greater artist who's had even more than Swift's 7 eras. You know who it is, don't you? Kylie Minogue. Kylie has had 8 eras, and here we'll explore them briefly and hopefully show how she is the one true pop princess. Era 1, Kylie from Surrey Hills. We first met Kylie in the soap opera Neighbours. I never watched the show. My goodness, look at all that hair. And then this happened. Era 2, where the first 2 fully fledged albums with Stock Aitken Waterman were full of pop bangers, but the third ran out of steam a little. Era 3. Now she's hanging out with Michael Hutchence and Nick Cave, making really good records and going through a succession of dodgy haircuts. Era 4. An era of massive commercial success and obsessive overexposure of her shapely hindquarters. Era 5. Her spell as the Pink Wiggle, short though it was a period of massive artistic growth.
It's no lie, it's no lie. Hugging up the big monkey man.
Era 6. As Kylie enters her 4th decade, she's determined to out-diva the diveriest divas and out-sexy the sexiest sex pots.
I was gonna cancel, but then you reminded me of who I am.
I have no idea what happened with Golden. All we know is that it didn't happen again.
When I go out, I wanna go out dancing tonight.
Era 8 is the least Kyliest era. It's all bangers and banging on about banging from here.
I hear it and I know I know you want it.
Well, Kylie may have sung about a monkey man she'd like to hug, but there's only one monkey around that we love. With this week's number 1, it's Monty the Safety Monkey. And it's Kim Carnes with Betty Davis Eyes, a 9-week number 1 stateside and 5 weeks here. Kim had been a backup singer and a handy songwriter for many years who'd flirted with hitdom through a duet with Kenny Rogers that had peaked into the top 40 the year before. But this was a resounding breakthrough, dispatching Shakin' Stevens and succumbing next week to the irresistible if pointless stars on 45. Now, I said that Carnes was a handy songwriter, but here's the thing. BDE wasn't written by her, it was a cover, which means she joins that club of singer-songwriters, Laurie Nero and Hank Williams, for example, are members, who had their biggest hits with songs they didn't write. Ironically, Betty Davis Eyes was co-written by Jackie DeShannon, another handy singer-songwriter who had her biggest hit with a song she didn't write. Of course, What the World Needs Now Is Love by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. The circle of life. Well, folks, there we have it. That is how the cow ate the cabbage this week, July 19th, 1981. Rest assured, should the good Lord be a willing and the creeks don't rise, we'll be back with another instalment next week. Ish.